Hello, and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Graeme Atkinson. I'm a co-founder and director of Procurement Consulting Limited. And today's webinar, we will be discussing innovation in public procurement projects, managing risk appetite. At this point, I would like to introduce my panel. And before we get started, I'm just going to make the point that please note that the views expressed today are those of the panelists only and not necessarily the organizations that they work for. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Rikesh. Rikesh is head of the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Center at Connected Places Catapult. Rikesh, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Graeme. Good afternoon. Also, Rikesh Shah, as Graeme mentioned, I head up the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Center. And primarily that's there to say, how can we help public sector organizations be a better buyer and as a result bring the innovation that's there in the marketplace and scale it and create new value. I'll talk more about it during the session this afternoon. And prior to this, I was the head of innovation at Transport for London, which is a big procurer and needs lots of innovation. And I'll talk a little bit about that during this afternoon too.
Right, thanks, Rikesh. And introducing Scott Tacchi. Scott is head of MMC at Sir Robert McAlpine Limited. Scott, could you just introduce yourself a bit for the people?
Graeme, thank you very much. And yes, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. As introduced, my name is Scott Tacchi, so I'm head of modern methods of construction within Sir Robert McAlpine, a tier 1 billion a year turnover main contractor in the UK. And I work across all business groups. So I work on nuclear, I work on highways and infrastructure, I work on hospitals and traditional sort of more commercial construction projects. Before joining Sir Robert McAlpine 18 months ago, I was head of modern methods of construction at the Department for Education and ran a £3 billion off-site construction programme buying schools, volumetric and panelised. Thank you, Graeme.
Thank you, Scott. Great, okay. So before we get started, I just need to advise the audience that you are able to ask questions during the course of the webinar. And please do submit these questions to our panels. It really helps to bring the conversation to life. If you are new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen. Just to note that we will pick up as many as we can go through the session, and we will try to get to them all, but it depends on how many we get, obviously, and the time that we have permitted to us. Okay, so let's kick off then. So the first question on our agenda is, how well are current public procurement practices adapting to societal and environmental challenges? And for this, I'd like to hand over to Rikesh to kick off for us. Rikesh, what do you feel about that?
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. And I know our other colleague who couldn't make it, Bridge, also had strong views on this. But I'll kick it off. And I think just to set some context, the public sector spends about £300 billion per year on procurement. And 70 billion of that is spent by local authorities. Just a significant amount. And that doesn't include the level of spend that goes through human resources, the level of people that are involved in it. So the total actual cost could be close to £1 trillion. And I think the need to do more for less has never been more paramount. And to, again, give it further context, whether it's challenges around crime, whether it's challenges around social care, child services, health, or even the climate emergency. There are so many areas here that we just need to add new value for our citizens. And that means that there is an absolute need to change. And I think that also creates an opportunity for procurement and procurement colleagues. You know, we have to challenge the hypothesis that we have to overprescribe everything when we go out to the market. We also have to challenge the hypothesis that we can do everything ourselves. And what that means is, how do you curate a new ecosystem? Because the barriers to entry have come right down, and the different types of innovators now than perhaps there were 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And that means by curating the ecosystem means you don't have to, I know we've got Scott from McDonald, but we don't have to just work with the tier ones. The tier ones are brilliant and they add incredible value, but how do you diversify your supply chain? And then the second area is, how can procurement be a strategic lever for change? And generally, and I'm guesstimating here, but procurement teams hold about 60 to 70% of budgets in an organization. So they've got incredible influence within their own respective organizations. And quite often the focus becomes cost, or it becomes delivering against a specific timeline. And as a result, the administration sometimes takes over, creating best value at a holistic level. And by holistic, I mean, how do you achieve better outcomes? How do you achieve perhaps quicker outcomes? And of course, you want to focus on cost too. So there's an opportunity here for procurement to provide leadership as we shape markets, to really think about how can you create more value. And that's why we've set up the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre. You know, that's a government-funded program which is working very closely with local authorities and central government agencies to say, how do we get better at pipeline management, design thinking, experimentation, and so forth. So if you're a public body, sorry to just plug this, you know, do visit ipec.org.uk, and we're happy to help and support, and it won't cost you anything. Back to you, Graeme.
Thank you, Rikesh. That's really insightful, and I think it's so relevant today, given the challenges that we all face in terms of society and the environment, that we need to be able to drive that value right to the front end. And Scott, you're really interested to see your views on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I just look at the bottom line there, if I deem societal being social value, how do we define social value, and how do we define environmental changes, maybe focusing on net zero? I certainly see maybe over the last 4 or 5 years how public sector procurements and frameworks have really been stepping up, setting benchmarks, setting really some quite stretched targets in how those things are achieved. But there is still a challenge with this, and I don't think we're quite there with it yet. What I'm seeing is quite often there is a pull in opposite directions around modern methods of construction, around social value, and around net zero, and they are often pulling in opposite directions and fighting against one another, particularly in the environment of social value and local spend versus modern methods of construction, which is about potentially off-site construction, industrialized construction in a remote factory. Those things really haven't been truly bottomed out yet. And in fact, I really quite often struggle with a further aspect of this in terms of sort of carbon zero tunnel vision, that we are focused on carbon zero to the point that we've lost, in many cases, the point of what we're doing, especially in public procurement, whereby it's costing 20% extra, so it means we're doing 20% less jobs, 20% less schools, 20% less hospitals, 20% less social housing, and I'm not sure that has really been fully grasped yet. How do we embed these goals into our procurement programs without sacrificing really what we're trying to do in the first place?
I agree with that, Scott. Thank you. So some really good insights to kick off there. Thank you. Before we go on to our second question, I did actually remiss me forget to sort of let everybody know that we unfortunately don't have Breach Ford, one of our other panel members, joining us today. She's unfortunately not well enough to attend. So, gents, thanks very much for that. Moving on then to question 2. And this one is regarding how public procurement can transition to become more of a strategic tool for innovation, rather than being viewed mostly as an administrative function. And for this, I'd like Scott to get your initial views, please.
Certainly, Graeme. So working as a civil servant, as I did for nearly 4 years, and being around the civil service for quite some significant time, I think possibly the best way to answer this is to look at some real examples of where procurements frameworks have been a strategic tool for change and innovation. So I'm going to run through maybe 4 or so examples, and then just maybe a couple of words on some caution. So DFE 2020 Offsite Construction Framework was based on a single rate agreed across all providers. Work was then awarded on a sliding scale against their KPI performance. The KPIs also had an incentivization process that was linked to innovation. Therefore, the more innovative, the better your KPIs, the more work you got. It wasn't a race to the bottom around price and slitting your wrists to win a project. The MOJ Super Prisons program, a program that's currently going forward with 4 contractors selected for an alliancing framework, jointly developing design, jointly developing supply chain, significant savings in cost and time and quality being brought out through that innovative approach to procurement. We have the new hospitals programme, and in fact there is a launch today around Hospital 2.0 by the new hospitals programme, a MMC approach to standardised design and delivery. But also within the NHP, you have KPMG, who are their procurement advisors. Much of that route to market is based on innovation, alliancing models, appropriate share of risk and reward. And as I've touched on already, the MMC design and innovation element aspect is key to its delivery. You have National Highways, who are in development of their next generation of collaborative and alliance-based framework models, putting industrialized construction and reduction of waste very much at the center of that model. For me, that's one of the most exciting potential procurements coming forward, using the ICE's Project 13 sort of recommendations as a route to market. But there are some warnings here, I think. So at the end of March, the Chief Executive, Mark Reynolds, who's the Chief Executive of MACE, hit out at clients around imposing unfair contract conditions on small contractors in the wake, particularly in the UK, of widespread construction insolvencies. I still see some significantly unfair conditions also being requested for Tier 1 contracting. I've unfortunately seen some clients thinking it's clever to deliberately drive contractors and suppliers against the wall. A few years back, I sat in a meeting where it was discussed that the tender price indices, so for those outside the UK, a mechanism used to adjust inflation on projects within primarily public sector. It was noted that it was not keeping up with inflation, and therefore contractors were losing money on every contract awarded. This was generally met in that meeting with "aren't we clever" and wholesale approval. I felt that was utterly immoral. That meeting that I sat in. And again, Mark from MACE, as well as many others, including the Chief Exec of McAlpine, who I worked for recently, called for an end to the race to the bottom contracting. For me, I hope, I'm a very positive person, I hope so, and I'm seeing a more enlightened approach to contracting models that are driving innovation in the UK and outside of the UK. But as the UK bounces in and out of recession, and as we head towards a general election, which will itself put brakes on construction and spend as people are waiting to see what happens at the end of this year, and with the public purse in the UK near bankrupt, I honestly fear a return to most economically advantageous tenders, a race to the bottom, which we saw in the recession of 2008 to 2015. Graeme, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. That's yeah, I think there's probably, as you say, some fair warnings out there. Probably what I'd ask is, Rikesh, how do you, in terms of just what Scott just outlined, how do you see how important it is to educate procurement professionals on the principles of innovative procurements, particularly around things like risk management, market engagements, and evaluating bids, to try and sort of like ensure that we're not going down that road and that race to the bottom, as Scott sets out, and rather focusing on how we can really drive that value?
Yeah, sure. And I think just building on what Scott said earlier as well, so I'll sort of answer some of that if I may, and then build on it here, is I think absolutely procurement should be a strategic function in my view. And I remember running a survey at TfL where we went out to our supply chain, current suppliers or future suppliers, and we said, what's the hardest thing about working with TfL? And it wasn't payment terms, it wasn't even trust, wasn't relationships. It was, you're really hard to innovate with because we've got some fantastic ideas, don't know how to actually share them with you. And that's why I think it's redefining what innovation means, because I think there's a bit of a monopoly with the tech teams and the engineering teams. They're the only ones allowed to innovate in organizations. I think you've got to shape an early pipeline if you want to innovate. There's no point saying I need to put a tender out in 2 weeks. What innovation's out there? You've got to start well in advance. You need leadership, you need change, because when you're bringing new stuff in, you're reforming the organization. I think you got to get better at problem statement definition. And I think you've got to work on co-development. So I think the role of procurement there should be much more around how do you get involved with the business planning process? How do you get involved with the sponsors? How do you challenge your service owners to say, we could do this differently? So I think there is a strategic role there for procurement colleagues, but there is a big but. It's a two-way street. The market also has to play the game. They can't just expect the public sector to spend loads of money on R&D, and then the private sector says, yeah, we'll try it. We'll spend the R&D efforts that you've got to the budgets and resource. And if it works, we'll benefit from it. But if it doesn't work, it's your loss anyway. So I think there's got to be a two-way street. And as a result, tier one suppliers have to stop just opening the briefcase and saying, what do you want to buy? I would rather the tier one suppliers approach us earlier and say, what are your problems and where do I need to invest my R&D efforts? So that's on the previous point. I think in terms of the risk averseness nature, there are massive barriers to procurement and barriers to innovation, sorry. And I think some of it's culture, some of it's not invented here. Imagine if you're a buyer in the public sector, there's never one buyer. There could be the tech team, it could be the engineering team, it could be the service owner. Suddenly you have about 15, 20 buyers. And all it takes is one of them for not liking the idea or saying it's too risky, and it fails. I think the other area is there has to be internal alignment and between the sponsor and everyone else. Unless you have that internal alignment and openness to innovation, it will die quite quickly. I think you've got to get better at the horizon scanning. Yeah, everyone's talking about Gen AI at the moment. Well, what does Gen AI mean in the context of your job? And what does it mean in the next 5, 10, 15 years? I think you've got to properly experiment and build the evidence rather than going with gut instinct. You've got to get better at scouting across the world. But the fear of failure is also a big reason why things fail. And I think we worry sometimes too much about what the media might say. We worry too much about what the stakeholders might say. We worry about what the politicians might say. And of course, they're key stakeholders. But how do you create the right guardrails so you can innovate within that process? And I think a couple of examples that my previous team did, we started with 100 problem statements per year, stuff that were really stuck on innovation was needed. And then we narrowed them down to 30. We explored, are the conditions for success good? And if they are, what 30 could we focus on? And then they turned into serious briefs. We probably turned them into experiments. And then out of those, 3 or 4 things passed. So a whole lot of things failed. But because you put the right safeguards in place, that's why we've got things like open data. So the open data work now, every pound that's invested in open data in London, you get 130 back. And that started in the same process. You gave it a go, you put the right guardrails in place, and then you look to scale. So I think it can be done, but sometimes procurement unfairly gets the blame. When I think procurement is part of a process and you need the right route to market, but there is a wider systematic approach for procurement to really work and through innovation through procurement to work in organizations.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Rikesh. And as you say, that balance is so important to strike, because ultimately there needs to be some recognition that, you know, the market's not going to take those risks without having enough sort of rewards on the horizon for them to go down that road. Thanks, gents. I think let's move on if we can. So moving on into question 3. The approach that, well, the question is, and I think it actually sort of brings a little bit of what we were just describing, but is public procurement overly risk averse in adopting innovative solutions technologies? And I think, is that basically something that's inherent either in the process of the procurement processes themselves or the delivery phase of projects? And if so, how can this be overcome? And Rikesh, I think just following on from what you were just earlier saying, it's a good segue into that actually, because I feel like there is a risk aversion, I think, around how we go about procuring, and that's something that we need to address.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a couple of points here. I think the first one is, even before we've gone live with the procurement, as soon as you go live, you're already 2 or 3 years out of date, because it might have taken you that long to do the procurement and then do the mobilization. So you're already behind the curve on innovation. And then if it's a 10, 15-year contract, where's the incentive for the supplier to consistently innovate? So by the time you get to year 10 of your contract, of a 15-year contract, innovation's completely disappeared. And perhaps I'll talk about it later, but I think what we need to do is create this gain share model where the public sector buyer and the supplier are both putting in that shared value, but ultimately there is a risk that they're both taking, and based on the risk, there's a reward. And I think that's where we need to sort of change the model. Otherwise, you produce something, it sits there, it deteriorates, and then you retrofit.
Yeah, absolutely. And nothing happens. I think that's right. You know, there's no point in thinking out these fantastic ideas if they're just going to sit on the shelf. Scott, what's your view?
Yeah, I got maybe a slightly different view on this. Earlier on, I mentioned 4 really innovative clients, government departments that are doing some very innovative solutions to procurement. They are met also, however, with challenges in being innovative. So Her Majesty's Treasury put requirements around competitive pricing, which if it's truly competitive pricing or most economically advantageous tender, it will drive a solution which is the cheapest. Cheapest is never the most innovative. Cheapest point of buying a solution where you're looking at 20% of the total life cycle cost is in the original procurement, 80% is over the life of a project. We should be looking at the life of the project, not just the 20% of the cost and trying to shave 2 or 3% off of the cost of that 20%. It's an oxymoron in its delivery, but that's forced by Treasury on many government procurement teams. We've also got an issue, I feel, around the should cost model. So if we look at construction playbook, one of the founding principles of the construction playbook, or the 14, is that government clients need to know or should know what the cost of what they're buying is. And government departments invariably don't know the cost of what they are buying. And my final point is, I think we've touched on already, it comes down to the individuals. I know of a procurement that I'm being told is about to start, and it takes 2 years, as Rikesh has noted, to do a procurement. But that department at the end of 2025 is looking to just turn over the exact same procurement model that's been running for the last 12 years already without changing the game. That's incredibly depressing from my perspective, that they're looking at a traditional procurement model with no innovation, no offsite, no nothing, just roll it forward for another 4 years. That comes down to the individuals being involved and the innovation and mindset that they have. I see it working extremely well, extremely innovative in some departments and not in others. We need education within certain departments.
Okay, thank you. And then do you think, particularly when it comes to public procurements, is there an apprehension to trying to do something innovative? Because, you know, most of the priorities potentially could be, you know, run a challenge-free procurement, you know, deliver on a set of stakeholder requirements, deliver to program. And, you know, is there sort of an apprehension about sort of trying to sort of do something more innovative that actually means that you might need to take some risk both in the process itself and also actually in delivery? Rikesh, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think you've got to create a process, a procurement process or a commercial process that incentivizes all parties to innovate. So I think the process needs to do that. And then 2, when it comes to delivery, absolutely you want to bring the best, you know, innovative ideas that can achieve cheaper, better, quicker outcomes. So you need the right mindset internally to that delivery. You need the right level of knowledge. So the public sector needs to be the intelligent client. But also you can't bring that in and you can't deliver it unless you've applied the right processes and you've incentivized the market to innovate with you. So I think it's got to be both. You can't just rely on one. Otherwise, what I've seen happen again and again is you do some R&D programs and after that nothing happens. It just stops because the commercial incentive's just not there.
Yeah, that ongoing framework. Okay, thank you. Right, let's move on then. So going into question number 4. And this one is around collaboration, particularly how can better collaboration between the public sector, private companies, and other stakeholders contribute to increased innovation in public procurement. So, you know, we've all got a role to play here, and I think that's basically, again, sort of picking up on your point, Rikesh. But Scott, why do you think this is important, and how can we do that better?
Okay, I'm going to start with trust. Okay, I feel there needs to be much greater trust between clients and contractors. In fact, within the whole supply chain, the historic contracting model of conflict, which has driven the industry for the last 30, 40 years, needs to be addressed head on. You know, in fact, it's almost to the day 30 years ago that Latham issued his original report to the UK construction industry, of which he spoke about collaboration, and here we are still 30 years on to the day talking about how do we better collaborate. Now, I'm not proud of what I'm about to say next, but I do quite a lot of university lecturing, and one of the lectures I start around cost management is that a headline, contractors always lie, because historically this has been the truth, but the same could be said of many clients who, through intentional or unintentional advice given by QS practices, try to deliberately mislead for commercial gain and advantage. So trust, I think, is key. Secondly, collaboration is certainly not the same as collusion. Again, something that I have personally been accused of orchestrating in the past by people who don't understand the difference between a collaborative approach with your supply chain and collusion. There needs to be open and honest supply chain dialogue in forums aligned to alliancing, where lessons learned can be shared, where across companies, because if you simply silo lessons learned, we'll be stuck in this fail, repeat, fail mode forevermore. Thirdly, if tender queries are purely focused, as I've touched on, the most economic advantageous tender, or in other words, the cheapest, a client will be able to buy something at the very bottom of the price metric. This will not include anything that's innovative. It certainly won't be collaborative, because more than often the contractor will have priced it below the point of delivery, and so you immediately start a conflict contracting scenario. So again, moving away from race to the bottom. For there to be true innovation in capital programs, you simply cannot hold the organization that's going to build the capital project for you, the contractor, at arm's length until it is fully developed to a REBA stage 3 or 4. As per the construction playbook, early contractor involvement, I believe, is absolutely key to driving innovation and driving out waste, driving out cost, improving program, reducing defects, and improving health and safety. 70 to 80% of the work that I see coming into McAlpine is already designed to REBA stage 3, and therefore I've lost about 70% of the opportunity to improve that project, and that's hugely frustrating. Thank you, Graeme.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, no, that's some really important points there. And you know, the commercial model and the pricing approach that public sector organisations take in their procurement approach does directly affect that, in my opinion. It feels like, you know, particularly on two-stage tendering, you want obviously early contract engagements, but you also want to retain that value for money and that competitive pricing throughout the life of that. So both into stage 1 and stage 2, and it's that balance, I think, is always difficult to strike, but it's absolutely necessary, I think, because you know, without that early collaboration, you do lose a lot of benefit and opportunity. Rikesh, I don't know if you got a view on that.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you have said, and I think there's a fundamental point here that the relationship between the public and the private sector, the buyer and seller, needs to be less transactional. And it's just too transactional at the moment. It's one-off contracts that have been awarded. So I think we need to get much better at sort of open marketing, pre-market engagement, being absolutely well in advance of where your challenges are and where you need help from the market. I think there has to be a long-term partnership, you know, whether it's through existing contracts or new contracts. How do you build that trust, as Scott said, with the market out there? I think there has to be that portfolio view, which because sometimes I think the market comes in and they want a short-term win, or some things are going to fail, and you may not get the long-term contract on that, but some things will stick. So how do you have that portfolio view at it? I think the other thing is the R&D. So this is at the early stages of innovation. The R&D has got to be around shared value. So in the case of the public sector, you're sharing problem statements, you're perhaps sharing data, you're giving access to an incredible asset. You know, if I think about TfL, asset to the underground, to the road network, to the bus network, it's pretty significant. But you're also providing subject matter expertise, where you're bringing policy experts in. That's got a lot of value. But the market then is bringing its best R&D brains and solutions to bring stuff together. So how do you focus on shared value and then perhaps start moving into the commercial conversation? Because I think sometimes we have that commercial conversation up front, and then from an innovation point of view, you don't even know what the solution is. So it's unfair on the market to price it too early, because they'll overprice it if you're asked to put pressure on them. And if you ask the buyer what the price is, they'll just say, this is my budget and that's it. So suddenly you're having an unfair conversation. So as a result, I think you've got to spend a bit more time on R&D, see what the cost could be, but don't wait too long, because if you wait too long, perhaps people start revealing the cards and suddenly the price goes up significantly because the public sector really likes the solution. So I think there's got to be a balance on how you do this. And at the moment, in short, I would say create that shared value approach, create a portfolio approach, look at it from a long-term point of view, and accept that things will fail, but the one or two that will succeed will pay for everything that you've invested.
Yeah, that's some really valid points there. And you know, the touching on the as you say, the transactional nature of procurement, I think, is definitely a barrier. There has obviously been some strides taken towards sort of adapting and changing that. Obviously, the new procurement regulations, there's the competitive flexible procedure now. Obviously, we had competitive dialogue that we used. There is obviously the opportunity for us to actually talk to the supply chain through that evaluation, but it's always a lot more safe, shall we say, to be able to sort of do it in a more transactional way. For example, you know, RFP proposal come in, you know, do that transaction. And I think that's probably the problem, because a lot of that gets lost. Okay, thank you very much. Just conscious of time, let's move on. So going into question number 5. I'll just check if there's any questions. Nothing from you. Right, so this is question number 5, which is about how can supply chain management and practices be optimized to better support innovation in public procurement? I guess probably, if it's okay, guys, I'll take this one to start off with, being part of obviously what we specialize in at Procure. But for me, particularly around what constitutes good SEM to help support that innovation in public procurement, I think you touched on it earlier, Rikesh. You've got to be transparent with your pipeline, you know, particularly also for SMEs, but not even necessarily for your tier ones as well, because they've got to manage their supply chains too. Better transparency and early transparency of what public sector intends to buy makes such a difference, because it means that you can start making those investment decisions, particularly if you want to develop software or you need to go out there and procure plants to enable you to be competitive in that tender, or make those resourcing decisions. And you know, it's just a core issue, I think, still. And I feel like, you know, there's definitely been, you know, attempts made in the UK recently to help sort of provide that visibility, but it still feels like we're falling short in many ways. And I'm not going to suggest that that's anything to do with obviously the public sector organisations. I think everyone's aware of that. It probably stems somewhat, if I may, to, you know, political and socio-economic factors that are affecting countries, you know, not just the UK. Obviously, we're living in an uncertain age, and I think that has an impact on it. But that for me, that's definitely one where we could see better processes supporting innovation. I feel like that early engagement in supply chain would be beneficial as well. Obviously, there's the opportunity for public sector to actually go out and start talking to supply chain in a safe way, through prior information notice engagements, and also sort of having those market engagements to get their views on how they might be able to use the procurement processes and procedures in a way which actually enables and engenders innovation to sort of be there, particularly around sort of, you know, I guess there's going to be some early adopters of that competitive flexible procedure, and that could be an example of it. And then I think, you know, one more thing I was thinking and reflecting on is definitely to effectively map your supply chain capability and understand actually what innovations they've been working on in the background. You know, projects like the Low Thames Crossing, obviously, where they've got the hydrogen-enabled plants, which they're pushing on really heavily. I feel like that is, you know, great innovation and a delivery space. Someone had to make that investment decision, and they needed to have some certainty from, you know, the likes of National Highways or government to say, actually, this is going to be a, you know, a value add, and you're going to get your money back at some point. But we needed to understand that the capability was out there as well in order to set those requirements at tender stage. So I think that's definitely another one for procurement teams to be better at in terms of sort of understanding actually what is the capability of the supply chain to do to be innovative, because there's no point in asking for it if you don't have the skills there. I don't know, Scott, your view on that one?
Yeah, obviously historically as a civil servant responsible for quite a significant program of work, I now feel a lot of pain around supply, pipeline confidence. You know, I've gamekeeper turned poacher is sort of how I feel now, and I look back at my old self, okay, and I look back at other government departments with a total lack of faith, if I am honest. And this isn't just me, this is of colleagues outside of my current employer who I still talk to significantly, because we have been let down so often by pipelines and promised pipelines that have never materialized, or have materialized only at 20 or 30%. There is a real issue, I feel, within the public procurement and within government, and perhaps one for the Infrastructure Projects Authority to address, is that if contractors and supply chain are to innovate, we've got to, and spend the money speculatively, we've got to have faith that the programs will be forthcoming. And the greatest example of this is the recent cancellation of High Speed 2. That should never have been called High Speed 2. It should have been called, Capacity Improvement 2. But this is a dramatic and significant backward step for us in terms of faith that what government and government departments say they're going to do, that they will follow through on. There is incredible innovation within that program of work that will now in future be lost.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Scott. We've got some questions, and actually, if it's all right, I'll direct them to you guys. Got a question from Oliver. How can you expect more contractors and clients to be more collaborative when it seems the industry is being more cutthroat due to margins, targets, cost increases, and KPIs, objectives being increased year on year? Rikesh, what do you think about
that? Yeah, I think as a buyer, the public sector, we need to be a bit more vulnerable. We need to actually say where we're stuck and share that up front with the market. Say, we need to, we're spending X currently, and we need to reduce that cost by Y over a 10-year period. How can the market help? As opposed to saying, let's just go out with the same stuff that we bought and cut it by 10% next year. Because that means that we're just not leveraging best value from the market. So I think it comes back to your point, engage with the market earlier, be absolutely clear on where you're stuck, and let's see what the market comes back with in terms of solutions, and then design the procurement processes so you get best value. So I take Oliver's point, but I think if we carry on with the mentality that we had X million last year, and then we're going to cut it to Y this year, and now work with it, it doesn't help anyone, because all that will happen is budgets will get tighter, we'll get a substandard product, and we won't get the public policy outcomes that we want. So we have to find a new way of doing things, and that's by sharing where we've got challenges, and both parties taking a risk, provide that shared value.
I agree with that, definitely. We've got a question from H. What's the panel's thoughts on early contract involvement benefits to overcome some of the challenges we're facing? I think we touched on that earlier. So I'll keep going through, because I am just conscious of time and I want to get to the other questions in the agenda. Now, we do have a question from Dave as well. Value is a key word. If we accept that the maximum value is created in the early stages of the projects, then the market needs to be engaged in creating that value, and that does not mean just accepting the standards that are out. What is the panel's view on how we innovate this change to better value standards? Scott? What do you think?
Okay, I'm going to start by maybe addressing an item of concern. So I've been told recently that the value toolkit is being dropped. Okay, dropped by its sponsors, dropped by CLC, dropped by IPA, dropped by government. Okay, for me, that is an incredibly concerning piece, if what I'm being told is correct, because it suggests that we're moving back to a most economically advantageous tender position through government, and that we're just chasing bottom line and pretty much, well, whatever goes with just cheapest price contracting. I think value is absolutely key. Clear identification of value, clear identification of what as a client you're trying to achieve, clear identification that value comes through what do you do with your capital asset, and that shaving 1 or 2 or 5% off the capital asset could actually significantly damage the cost or the delivery of service or whatever you're doing through that capital program. Again, something that I use in lecturing, that many know the cost, few know the value. So when you value engineer a project to cut out cost, what are you really cutting out? A monkey can tell you what the cost of something is. It takes skilled professionals, people in the industry, to tell you what the true value of what it is that you're cutting out and what that will do to service delivery down the line. We are focused on the monkey rather than on the true value that's delivered down the line.
Yeah, we get the monkey off our back. Okay, thanks, Jens. Moving on. We did have one more question on that one, which is, does the market have a big enough voice to influence change? It's a good question. I'm not sure anyone knows exactly the answer to that, but it does beg the question. Okay, so, sorry.
Could I give you one practical example on that one?
You can.
Really, so it was a while ago, and I had when I was at TfL, and I had a conversation with a large OEM, and I thought the OEM will bang on at me about why connected autonomous vehicles are the next big thing for London and why we need to be setting up the right infrastructure, and because that's what most OEMs did. And then as part of that conversation, I said, I'm less interested in the autonomous part, but I'm interested in the connected part. What data is your car collecting that could make London better? And I thought they'll go away and they'll say not interested. They then came back and said, we've got some ideas. And those ideas were around, an average car has about 100 sensors. And what they said is, we can tell you what the level of road temperature is on a snowy day, so you know where you can grit London's roads more accurately, so you reduce road risk. Then they built on from that, and they said, you know what, we can tell you where cars are disproportionately swerving, skidding, accelerating, because we've got that in our sensor data in certain parts of London. So as a result, answering that question, we completely changed the way we thought about road risk, because we used to respond to tragedies or serious injuries. But now we're starting to get data on near misses. And that's an example where the markets come in, influencing us completely to think about risk modeling and how we invest road safety interventions, whether it's road infrastructure, whether it's marketing campaigns, whether it's education. So I think absolutely the market, if you engage early enough in an open manner, the market can completely influence. And now this organization, Mercedes, is directly partnering with TfL based on that engagement through an open procurement process. So the answer is yes, it can be done. But if you're too close with your thinking, they'll never come in.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, thank you, Rikesh. Right, just moving on then into our final 15 for the session. So question 6, which is about how we can bring in SMEs more, and that's given that many innovative solutions and technologies originate from SMEs, how can SMEs be brought more into the public procurement process and be encouraged to bid? So as an SME procured, I'm going to just take this one if it's all right to start off, but I'd say probably, you know, there's a few things there, and there's some common obstacles to SMEs participating in public procurement. Often it can be that buyers set up procurements to meet the requirements of their sponsors, and those requirements can often be very complex and not necessarily suitable for SME market. several reasons potentially. It could be the budgets available and the time to advertise and procure multiple smaller opportunities rather than one large transaction. You do see a trend to basically need to have, large scale procurements. So that would sort of help public sector buy more quickly. The organization's capability to manage multiple contracts concurrently as well. When you think about the organizational structure, they might not just be geared up for it. Sufficient insight into the SME market, for example, and maybe organizational change required to adopt a more SME-friendly risk position to encourage SMEs to bid. So things around liability and insurance levels. There are some reasons why there can be obstacles, but it doesn't necessarily mean that SMEs wouldn't be able to be brought into that procurement process. Certainly, there's things that you can do to step down and make, at a tier 2 or 3 level, the obligations for tier 1s to be more sort of SME friendly. It's not necessarily just a complete flow down of clauses. So there needs to be some recognition that SMEs take risk, and they should do, but equally it should be balanced against what they need to deliver as well, like any organisation. There's also a number of programs and initiatives that SMEs can sort of leverage nowadays. We've got obviously the new procurement regulations coming through. Everyone should or would be aware of things like dynamic purchasing systems, but
have we lost Graeme?
Certainly lost sound.
Graeme, we've lost sound on your side. I don't know if you can hear us. What I'll do, can I just build on it, Graeme, whilst you're coming back? I'll build on it whilst we wait for Graeme. So I think my reflection. Are you back, Graeme? No. I'll carry on. So I think first is that, in my view, creating a level playing field. Secondly, I think there needs to be more transparency and honesty. And the route to market's absolutely right. We also have to work out. And secondly, we have to translate, because sometimes a big buyer and a startup may have a language issue in terms of pace. And the example I'll give is we ran a program for London Road Lab. And what we did there is we issued a statement, which was help us reduce the adverse impact of roadwork. And I think that would be one of my first points, is innovation doesn't have to be big, nor does it have to be shiny. And then when we went out with a problem statement, we reduced the paperwork. So we tried to make it quite simple for a startup to bid, as opposed to having 63 pages of documentation. Then we shortlisted, and we got 120 responses. We reduced that to 10. We then ran an R&D process. And within that, we got lots of different ideas. So we didn't get all the same stuff, we got different solutions. And then we iterated some of the solutions through that process. And after iterating, we asked for the business cases. So what did you learn from the R&D? And this is where we applied an innovative procurement, innovative partnership procedure, which is like the competitive flexible procedure, which allows you to iterate along the way. Ultimately, you can scale. And in the end, we scaled with 2 startups that sat in the control room with some of the biggest tier 1 suppliers there are. But secondly, it also created new IP, which allowed us to commercialize other cities. So there's an example there of how you can bring startups in, create the right conditions. Scott, I'm not sure if you've got any back.
No, the only real comment I would make in relation to SMEs is the daily concern that we, certainly within McAlpine, have around insolvency at the moment, and for SMEs to sort of come more to the fore, there needs to be a careful look at their balance sheet. It is a real concern given where we are in the UK at the moment, the thousands of SMEs going under. So that is a daily piece that the entire procurement team within McAlpine are working on.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, James. I think I lost contact there for a bit. Can you hear me okay?
Indeed.
Right back. No, I appreciate that. Right, moving into our final 10 minutes then. Next question that we're going to talk about is how can governments and policy help drive innovation, both in procurement, public procurement processes and in the use of innovative solutions and technologies in the delivery phase of projects? Rikesh?
Yeah. Sorry, thank you. So I think a couple of examples that I'll give. I think the first thing is there has to be a long-term view on this, as I was describing earlier, because some of these assets are around for a long time, so there has to be a long-term perspective. And let me give you one example. So I was procuring not traffic lights, lampposts, thousands of lampposts in London. And the lampposts, let's be honest, its purpose hasn't changed much for the past 150 years. It's been there to produce light. And the innovation might have been the operational costs come down, it's a different type of bulb, there might be a sensor in there, and there might be different materials. But generally, the use case hasn't changed. But if we think about it now, in the next few years, which it already is happening, it could become an EV charge point. It could become an air quality sensor. And if you have got connected autonomous vehicles, it might be something that talks to the vehicles. So suddenly, in the next 10, 15 years, the use case could change. So as a buyer, you've got a few issues. You know, number one is, do you re-procure it 3 times, over the course of the period? Or are you better off doing it in a modular manner? So how do you sort of design the procurements at the design stage, which does some foresight and scenario planning of how could it change over the next 10, 15 years as we move into the delivery phase? And that delivery phase isn't just mobilization, it's the ongoing operations. So we designed an innovation schedule in one of the contracts in the procurement processes, which did exactly that. We want to make sure that on a monthly basis, the service owner was meeting with the supplier, and there's some budget allocated for it, but there was also joint budget to say, how do we also think about innovation outside the day-to-day activity, so we can always be match fit and future-proof as best as we can. So I think that's one example. And the other one is we did something with Bosch. So Bosch said we want to invest some of our R&D efforts in London and use London as a test bed. And the program that we worked with them on is, it was an experiment that if you held traffic back from a densely populated area and it smoothly flowed through a densely populated area, what impact is it having on the air that people are breathing in? And we couldn't figure out how human, because air quality is so complicated with typology of buildings, with the types of vehicles that are going by, etc., etc. So Bosch created some new sensors from the R&D center, which were a world first, and we got some modelers in from different expertise, and we ran that experiment. And what that experiment told us, and so this is live traffic lights, and you got 6,500 of them across London. But what the experiment told us is, by doing this, you're reducing exposure to bad air by 20%. So that same model then was used for 1,200 signal changes across London, which means that the level of bad air that's being taken in has reduced, which has a direct impact on people's health and respiratory diseases. So there are 2 very different examples there. One's lampposts, one's live traffic signals. How can you start bringing innovation in? And it can be done, but you've got to, again, build the evidence in a test bed environment before you start scaling. And before you scale, you've got to iterate, because it's not a linear process. Great.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rikesh. That's really useful insights. Okay, I'm just conscious that we are running into our last few minutes of the session. So the last question is, can we provide some case studies of innovative solutions or technologies that were implemented in the delivery phase of projects? And Scott, I'm interested in your views on this one, given your experience on Tier 1 delivery.
Okay, thank you, Graeme. Starting with a word of caution before I give an example. Okay, sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between innovation and iterative improvement. And I believe we do need to show some degree of caution, because innovation without development is dangerous and it does cost lives. Okay, recent history is littered with innovation without development. We have CLAS, we have RAC, we have large panel systems such as and collapses as Ronan Point. We have some recently volumetric suppliers building dangerous buildings. All these systems have been rushed into manufacture, and I do mean rushed into manufacture, without providing a thorough and thought out testing, development and QA regimes that prove product worthiness. You know, I am focused on good execution of contemporary innovation, industrialized construction, standardization, rather than trying to find the new silver bullet. You know, we have an example, and I will give you one now, a 250, so this is from McAlpine. When I say we have a £250 million flagship scheme for a university in the UK that is using BIM modeling across its entire supply chain, use of CGIs. The MEP supplier was integrated into the design 3 years before we started on site. We are using prefabrication, off-site fabrication in future staircases. We are using point cloud scanning of the structure as it goes up to enable the unitized cladding design, which is being done in Poland and manufactured, to be millimeter perfect. We are using the same process for precasting that's being done in Ireland. We're using large span panel pre-assemblies for the roof, steel beams that are fabricated to aerospace levels of tolerances. We have a near site factory doing all the casting prior to it going into the ground. And because of our approach to MEP, we've taken 36,000 man hours off site and into a factory. We're also looking at future technologies such as the integration of numerous packages, Dalux, 4D Synchro, drone survey, build dots, and the scanning of people, trades as they come onto the building site. All of that going into a single model so that we can actually track productivity on a weekly basis and track defects almost down to the individual that's doing the work on a weekly basis, giving us what will be the first, as far as I'm aware, in the UK, measure of true productivity per trade and per worker output. I think there's great innovation out there. It just simply needs to be asked for. But what you don't get that from a race to the bottom. Thank you, Graeme.
You certainly don't. Thank you, Scott. Rikesh, any closing points on that one?
Just one really quick. I agree with everything that Scott said. I want to hear more about the case studies that are out there and promote them. So through this government funding program we have, I think we need to change the perception that this stuff can be done, as opposed to it's too difficult and too hard. So I'd ask anyone in the audience that if you're working on public sector contracts at the moment and you're bringing innovation in and it's scaling, let me know, and I'll assure you I'll promote it and we'll push it hard, because we need to win hearts and minds here and educate.
Yeah, indeed. All right, well, thank you very, very much, Rikesh. Scott, thank you very much as well. Just a reminder to everybody that's joined the webinar today, thank you also very much for your time, and that we will publish the recording and a written summary of today's webinar online. And please do feel free to share those with your professional networks as you see fit. And please take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. And last but not least, future webinars, please be advised of the forthcoming webinars, which can be seen on the screen right now. We hope to see you in the future. And then a couple more for us to go through. Megatrends, exploring the issues that will define the world for decades and generations to come. Please check recs.org.w/WBEF for further details. And if you require any further information, please search recs.org.WBEF or search the World Economic Forum on LinkedIn. And that is last but not least. Thank you very much for your attendance today. Rikesh, Scott, it's been a pleasure. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.